All right, let's dive into one of the most beautiful, passionate, and, let's be honest, one of the most confusing books in the entire Bible, the Song of Songs. For thousands of years, this book has puzzled pretty much everyone who's read it, and today, we're going to figure out why.
You know, the whole mystery really boils down to this one simple question. How in the world did a collection of sensual, sometimes shockingly explicit love poems end up in sacred scripture? Answering that question gets us right to the heart of what this incredible book is all about.
And this is where it gets really wild. See, around 90 AD, a really influential scholar, Rabbi Akiba, said that this book, a book that doesn't even mention God's name once, was the most sacred book of all, the holiest of the holies. So how can it be both of those things, intensely physical and incredibly holy? That's the puzzle we're here to solve.
To really get a feel for just how puzzling this book can be, let's jump right into a scene from chapters 6 and 7. I think this part really captures the vivid, almost overwhelming imagery and the challenge of figuring out what it all means.
Okay, so the scene is a wedding. The guests are calling out to the bride, this woman they call the Shulamite, asking her to come back and dance for them so they can all just look at her. And what comes next is this unbelievably detailed, poetic description of her body as she moves.
The poetry is, well, it's intimate, it's physical. Your rounded thighs are like jewels. Your belly is a heap of wheat. I mean, this is not subtle stuff, right? It's a frank, open admiration of the female form that you just really don't expect to find in the Bible.
And then we get to this famous line, which to us today sounds a little weird. Calling your beloved's nose a tower probably wouldn't go over too well these days. It just goes to show how hard it can be to take this poetry at face value.
But hold on, biblical scholar Dr. Lloyd Carr has this fantastic insight. He says, look, this isn't about the size of her nose. The Tower of Lebanon was famous for being built with this smooth, pale limestone. So the compliment is actually about her beautiful, fair complexion. And that's a huge clue. We're dealing with a symbolic language here, not just a literal physical description. So, because the text is so physical, so explicit, people throughout history have had to come up with some really creative ways to understand it. They've been trying to solve this ancient puzzle of its meaning and its purpose for a very long time.
For centuries, the go-to solution was something called allegory. This basically assumes that the words you're reading on the page, well, they aren't the real point. They're like a secret code, a metaphor for some higher, more spiritual truth.
And to show you just how far this went, get this. A line about a woman's navel being like a bowl of wine was reinterpreted to mean the church altar that holds communion wine. The literal meaning was just completely erased and replaced with a hidden spiritual one.
And it wasn't just allegory. Oh no. Over the years, people have argued that the book is everything from a cleaned-up pagan fertility ritual to a funeral poem, a political jab at King Solomon, or, of course, a symbolic story about God and Israel, or Christ and the church. The list of theories is just wild.
But here's a radical thought. What if everyone was overthinking it? What if the book isn't a secret code we need to decipher? What if its true meaning is actually the most obvious one and it's been hiding in plain sight this whole time?
According to Dr. Carr, there is a key that unlocks the whole book. And it's not some complicated allegorical code, but a powerful, repeated image that's woven all the way through the text. The garden.
This is where we find our key. It's called the garden motif. And you need to understand, throughout this book, the word garden isn't just about plants and flowers. It is a very specific metaphor, one that has clear romantic, even erotic overtones, representing the bride herself in the sacred space of their marriage union.
And you might think, okay, that's a nice image, but get this. In this one very short book, the garden motif shows up about 20 times. When a symbol appears that often, it's not just a cute detail anymore. It's the central message.
And you can literally trace this metaphor as it builds. The lover calls his bride a garden locked. Then she invites him in, saying, "Let my beloved come to his garden." And finally, he declares, "I come to my garden." The progression there is intimate and it is unmistakable.
All of this intense repetition, this focus on the garden, makes the book's purpose incredibly clear. It points directly to the physical consummation of marriage as the literal and thematic centerpiece of the whole story. It isn't a hidden meaning, it is the meaning.
So, if the book is literally about marital love, that still leaves us with that big question: why is it in the Bible? And this brings us to Dr. Carr's really powerful conclusion about what the Song of Songs is truly celebrating.
To put it as simply as possible, the Song of Songs is a celebration. It's not trying to hide some secret message, and it's not documenting a historical ritual. Its main job is to rejoice in something that is absolutely fundamental to being human.
So what exactly is it celebrating? Well, it's celebrating the sheer goodness of God's physical world. It's rejoicing in what Dr. Carr calls the maleness of the male and the femaleness of the female, and the beautiful, God-given sexuality that they share together within the bond of marriage.
And this, right here, is the profound takeaway. Dr. Carr suggests that the Song of Songs is kind of like God's own commentary on the creation story. It's a poetic echo of Genesis, when after creating humanity, male and female, he created them. God looked at everything and declared, "It was very good."
So the ultimate message of this mysterious book is this incredibly powerful affirmation. It's telling us that human love, physical intimacy, the bond of marriage, these are not shameful things that we have to hide or spiritualize away. No, they are a divine, intended, and very good part of God's design for all of us. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If we stop trying to treat this book like a secret code we have to crack, and instead we just read it as a joyful celebration of God's good creation, how might that change its meaning and its power for us today?